The north was a land carved by ice and tempered by fire. Mountains rose like jagged shields along the horizon, and deep fjords bit into the coastlines where the restless sea rolled in endless rhythms. In summer, the sun lingered so long that shadows seemed forgotten, yet winter returned with its iron grip, plunging the land into darkness where frost and storm ruled. Here, in scattered communities of timber and turf, men and women forged their lives with grit and stubbornness, never far from hunger, never far from the sea. A boy in such a village grew among the clang of tools and the smell of salt. From his earliest days he was taught to shape wood, mend nets, and mind cattle. He learned the stories told by the elders, of gods who battled giants, of heroes who won fame by blade or by bold voyage. His first games were with carved bone pieces and wooden swords, but behind them lay preparation. One day he would join the shield wall or the crew of a ship, and his name would matter only if it was spoken long after his death. The life of his people turned on the seasons. Spring was for sowing and repairs, when the thaw released streams and the first green shoots pushed through the earth. Summer brought the long days of work in the fields and pastures, but also the voyages of ships. Autumn was for the harvest, the gathering of grains and slaughter of livestock to prepare for the long cold. Winter was a season of feasting when food allowed, of storytelling around the central fire, of weaving, carving, and waiting for the return of light. Farms were small, their fields bounded by stone walls, their houses long and low, built to withstand storms. A family lived with their animals, smoke from the hearth seeping through the roof, light dim except for fire and torch. Their clothing was spun from wool and linen, dyed with earth and plant, simple and cut yet warmed with furs. Jewelry of bronze or silver marked wealth, and brooches fastened cloaks against the cold winds. Honor and kinship ruled life as much as hunger and weather. To be shamed was worse than to be wounded, for shame lingered long after scars. Quarrels could ignite feuds lasting generations, and blood cried out for repayment. Sometimes a feud could be settled with silver or cattle, but often it was settled with steel. Justice was sought not in courts but at the Thing, where free men gathered beneath the open sky. There, laws were recited from memory, disputes laid out before neighbors, and decisions made by oath and consent. A man's word bound him as tightly as his sword arm. Not all were free. Thralls worked the farms and households, slaves taken in raids or born into bondage. They cut wood, hauled stones, and tended fields under the command of their masters. Yet even thralls could be freed, and sometimes rose in status. Above the freemen stood the jarls, men of wealth and power who commanded war bands and ships, ruling more by loyalty than decree. The gods were present in every part of life. Odin was the seeker of wisdom, the one-eyed wanderer who traded his sight for knowledge and hung from the tree for runes. Thor, red-bearded and strong, protected mankind with his hammer, cracking giants' skulls as easily as a farmer split wood. Freya was both love and battle, her choice of the slain rivaling Odin's in Valhalla. Loki, sly and untrustworthy, played his games that would one day undo the world. Above all loomed fate, the inescapable thread spun by the Norns. No man could escape his death day, not even the gods themselves, and at Ragnarok all would be swallowed by fire and frost. The people honored their gods with sacrifice, by blood and by feast. At great gatherings, oxen and horses were slaughtered, their blood sprinkled over altars and men alike, their meat cooked and shared in ritual meals. Ships bore the dead to sea or were buried beneath earth mounds, the fallen laid out with weapons, tools, and treasures to carry into the next life. To die in bed was a small death, to fall in battle with courage was to earn the hall of the slain, where mead flowed and swords never dulled. Yet even as they honored their gods, they watched the horizon. The land, though beautiful, was never generous. Crops failed, winters bit deep, mouths grew hungry. A family could starve as easily as thrive. Sons grew too numerous for the fields to sustain, and pride and ambition pressed them outward. Beyond the sea lay monasteries rich with silver, towns filled with goods, and lands where soil was deep and fertile. For centuries they had built ships to fish, trade, and travel between scattered communities. Now the ships grew swifter, stronger, built with overlapping planks of oak, their hulls curved like serpents. With shallow keels they could ride the ocean or slip into the smallest rivers, striking swiftly and vanishing before a force could gather against them. At their prows they set dragon heads, carved to frighten spirits and men alike. These ships were more than vessels, they were weapons, extensions of ambition itself. It was in such a ship that men set sail toward a holy island off the coast of Northumbria in the year 793. The monks of Lindisfarne lived quiet lives of prayer, their walls filled with books, chalices, and relics of saints. One morning, as mist clung to the waves, the dragon heads appeared. Oars churned, and men leapt ashore with shields, axes, and spears. The cries of monks rose to the heavens, but no help came. Gold and silver were carried to the ships, captives taken, and blood stained the altar steps. The chroniclers of Christendom recorded the horror as if the world itself were ending. Yet to the raiders, it was the beginning of a new age. The longships returned to their fjords heavy with treasure, and soon more sails followed. From that moment onward, Europe would never again look at the northern horizon without fear. The smoke that drifted above Lindisfarne was carried out to sea by the same winds that filled the sails of the departing longships. What the monks saw as desecration and ruin, the Norsemen saw as proof. Their gods had blessed them. The raid had been swift, easy, and rich in spoils. The word spread across fjords and valleys that treasure lay unguarded in the lands of the south, where holy men hoarded gold behind thin walls. And with each telling, the story grew. Silver chalices became rivers of coin, docile monks became whole villages ripe for plunder. The next summer, more ships came. And the summer after, more still. At first, they struck like wolves, sudden, vicious, and gone before a warning could be carried inland. Monasteries fell, Jarrow, Iona, Bangor. The bells of churches rang not for worship but for alarm. To the Norse, the Christian world seemed soft, divided, and wealthy beyond imagination. It was everything their harsh homeland was not. But these were not men who raided for loot alone. The sea was in their blood. Some who set sail did not return home, but instead carved out new harbors, setting up camps that became settlements. In Ireland, Dublin grew from a Viking base into a bustling town of markets and shipyards. In England, raiders overwintered for the first time, no longer content with summer strikes. They pitched tents beside rivers, brought their families, and began to plant crops in the conquered soil. The year 865 brought a storm greater than any before, the Great Heathen Army. It was no band of raiders but an invasion force. Ship after ship poured onto the shores of East Anglia, led, the sagas say, by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar's story was half legend, half truth, the tale of a man who had raided Paris itself, who had laughed as he was cast into a pit of snakes, declaring that his sons would avenge him. Whether myth or memory, his name stirred men to follow his kin. Ivar the Boneless, cunning and feared, led the host, his condition leaving him unable to walk yet never keeping him from command. Beside him fought Halfdan, Ubb, and their brothers, each a warlord in his own right. Kingdom after kingdom in England crumbled. Northumbria fell, its capital York seized. Mercia bent to Viking terms. East Anglia was ground down. Only Wessex resisted. Alfred, not yet the king he would become, stood against them. He built fortified towns, Buzz, where villagers could retreat when the dragon ships appeared. He trained his warriors to fight not only in the shield wall but in quick strikes, harrying the Norsemen as they had once harried others. It was in this crucible that Alfred became Alfred the Great, the man who turned back the storm. But even as the Vikings clashed with Saxon kings, they were reshaping the very lands they raided. The Danelaw was born, vast stretches of England under Norse rule, where their language mingled with Old English, where their laws and customs intertwined with local ones. Farmers plowed fields beside men whose fathers had once burned their villages. place names bore their mark: Grimsby, Whitby, Derby. Words they spoke, sky, knife, husband, law, took root in the English tongue and have never left it. Across the Irish Sea, the Norse carved kingdoms from Gaelic soil. Dublin became their jewel, a center of trade and slavery. Ships came and went laden with furs, wine, ivory, and thralls. They married into Irish dynasties, sometimes enemies, sometimes allies, until bloodlines tangled like knots of rope. They built walls around their settlements, ring forts and strongholds, not only to protect their own but to mark their claim as lords of this new land. Southward, in Francia, the story unfolded differently. The raiders pushed up the Seine, striking Paris itself. The city endured siege and fire until the Frankish kings, weary of endless attacks, sought peace through concession. In 911, the Viking chieftain Rollo accepted a grant of land, Normandy. Here the Norse became Normans, adopting Christianity, speaking the tongue of their hosts, yet never forgetting their roots in the north. Their descendants would one day change the course of history, but that lay beyond the horizon still. Farther east, Swedish adventurers set their prows toward the great rivers that carved through forests and plains. They were not raiders so much as traders and rulers. Called Varangians, they followed the Dnieper and the Volga, founding settlements that would grow into Novgorod and Kiev. They carried furs, honey, wax, and slaves to Constantinople and Baghdad, returning with silver coins, silks, and spices that dazzled the eyes of those who had never seen such riches. In time, the rulers of Kievan Rus would claim descent from these men of the north, their legacy etched in the very fabric of Eastern Europe. The sea carried them farther still. Iceland rose out of the mist, a land of volcanic fire and glaciers. Settlers came with their families, their animals, and their sagas. There, without kings, they created the Althing, a gathering where laws were spoken aloud, judgments passed, and disputes settled, one of the earliest parliaments in the world. From Iceland, others pushed onward. Eric the Red, exiled for blood feud, sailed west and found a land of ice and stone. He called it Greenland, though it was anything but green, a name meant to lure others to settle there. His son, Leif Erikson, ventured farther still. Beyond Greenland lay Vinland, a place of wild grapes, thick forests, and native peoples who resisted the strangers with fierce resolve. For a time, the Norse built houses there, but isolation and conflict forced them back. Yet they had crossed to North America centuries before any others of Europe, their sails driven by restless need to go ever onward. The saga of the Norse was not only of raiding and settling but of war itself, a way of life. Weapons were treasured, the spear, every man's weapon, the axe, both tool and terror, the sword, rare and precious, a thing of lineage. Shields of wood and iron guarded them, round and painted, locking into the walls of men that held fast in battle. Some wore mail, few wore helmets, and many wore nothing but courage. In the frenzy of combat, berserkers were said to fight with the rage of beasts, biting their shields, howling like wolves, impervious to pain. Their leaders became legends. Ragnar Lothbrok, whether man or myth, lived in every tale of conquest. His sons carved their vengeance across England. Eric the Red's exile gave birth to Greenland, and his son to the first European step in America. Harold Bluetooth bound Denmark under the cross of Christianity, his rune stones boasting of his deeds. Knut the Great forged a North Sea empire, ruling England, Denmark, and Norway in a single crown, his power rivaling emperors and popes. And Harald Hardrada, last of the great Viking kings, met his fate in 1066 at Stamford Bridge, his army broken, his body fallen beneath Saxon steel. He had dreamed of England, but his death marked the end of the Viking Age. The decline had begun before his fall. Europe no longer lay open and undefended. Castles rose, stone walls defied fire, cavalry struck back against raiders before they could flee. Kings grew stronger, uniting lands that had once been easy prey. The Norse themselves changed. Their children were baptized into Christianity, their temples burned, their priests silenced. The gods of Odin and Thor gave way to the cross, and the rituals of sacrifice were replaced with the ringing of church bells. By the close of the 11th century, the Viking world had been reshaped. The longships no longer prowled coasts in search of plunder. The sagas began to be written down, preserving memories of a wilder age. The North had become kingdoms among kingdoms, part of Christendom, yet never entirely like the rest. Their mark endured, in words, in place names, in bloodlines, and in legend. The sea that had once carried their dragon ships carried their memory instead, a memory that grew into myth, so that long after their fall, the very idea of the Viking remained larger than life.